Today I take a drive down the Quicksilver Highway. Hello and welcome to RotD Review of the Day, and today I'm taking a look at the 1997 made-for-TV horror movie Quicksilver Highway. This was, I don't know about recommended to me, but it was suggested to me by RotD Soul and channel subscriber Ivy Killa. I did the review of Muse, which had Christopher Lloyd in it, and he was only in it for 5 minutes or so, but I was pretty impressed with his performance in that, and Ivy Killa responded saying, take a look at Quicksilver Highway, that might change your view on things. And I'm not quite sure exactly what the allusion to was there, but I watched it, and the one thing I will say about Christopher Lloyd's performance in Quicksilver Highway is that the effeminate goth look is not the best on him. But let's get into the meat of this movie by getting into the categories. As always, 4 different categories, each one worth up to 25 points for a total possible score of 100 points. And the plot of this one, the plot of this is, it's kind of a micro-anthology. It's only contains 2 stories, one from Stephen King and one from Clive Barker. The Stephen King one is based on a short of his called Chattering Teeth, and Clive Barker, it's the short story of The Body Politic. Now, both of these, I encountered these separately, where I was watching it, and then both times while I was watching it, a light bulb clicked in my brain, like, wait, I recognize this. I haven't seen this movie ever before, but I recognize this, and it dawned on me that I have read these stories years and years ago, and so it was causing a light bulb to kind of go off in my head. Now, I will preface this by saying that as far as plot goes, I will not be comparing this to the books. First of all, it's been way too long since I read them. I remember enjoying them, but all the nuance and subtext and little tidbits and so forth there that were on the printed page, I cannot recall with any sort of critical comparison to butt up against this movie. Second of all, I don't really like doing that in general. When I review a movie, I kind of want to review it on its own merits. I mean, it's the same reason I do just horror movies with a horror movie scoring system, is what is on the screen needs to be judged for what is on the screen. And I really try to make it a point to do that. So if I'm judging it based on source material, it's not going to ever really live up to it, especially if we're talking Stephen King. So ignoring the source material and just going by what was on the screen there, I gave the plot a 10 out of 25. The connectiveness of the stories was pretty much non-existent. You had Christopher Lloyd playing Aaron Quicksilver, and he was telling these stories to 2 different characters, one for each segment, and there was really no connectedness to it. He was out in the highway, invited her into his Silver Bullet trailer, which turned out like the TARDIS and way bigger on the inside, and started telling her a story about the Chattering Teeth. And then the next one, well, we clip right over to him having a tent in a kind of a dockside pier carnival, and telling a story to a ne'er-do-well that happens upon him. So the connectedness really wasn't really there, and as far as the Chattering Teeth segment goes, it was a bit dry. I do remember enjoying the book, but the sequence here, it was just a bit dry, and a little bit of, I don't know, what's the point almost. And as far as the Body Politic goes, that was interesting. I will say that actually for both of them, they were interesting, but the Body Politic in particular just wound up being, I think, inadvertently silly when you see a bunch of hands jumping off of a roof like lemmings, wee, freedom, wee. It is hard to look at that and not laugh. So I think that they missed the mark a fair bit, and so plot, I can't give it any higher than a 10 out of 25. The intent I think it goes even lower just because of this. And this is where I might compare the books, just because I think that was part of the intent, was to bring these stories to the screen, and the intent is going to judge how successful they were at this endeavor. And I remember the Chattering Teeth story. From what I do remember of it, I remember a lot of an element, especially towards the end, of fondness and embracing the protectiveness of the teeth that the main character had, like even going so far as to, I'm going to take you home to my son, and you're not going to let anything bad happen to him. And I really didn't get that element out of this, not to mention all the level of detail and introspection and so forth that Stephen King brings to his books, often in grueling detail, really didn't make it onto the screen, I felt. And I think it's one of the problems that is generally had trying to adapt his books to movies, that, the reason why we need, not just movies, but we need miniseries, or, now we're getting into, with streaming services and so forth, devoting, many seasons to an entire storyline being fleshed out. And I really think that that's necessary and critical for one of his books. And granted, this was just a short story, but even so, doing a 45-minute segment of it for a made-for-TV movie, or not even that, I think half an hour or so, it's just not going to do it justice, and I kind of felt like that was the case with the Chattering Teeth. As far as the body politic goes, that was a multi-layered kind of study in, human sociology and political bodies in, government and so forth. It had a lot of multiple layers to it, and ultimately what wound up on the screen here was just nothing but silliness and hands talking to each other with high-pitched voices until they get cut off, and then they're running around like the Thing. And it just wound up being silly. So all of the complexity that was involved in Clive Barker's works were just kind of totally out the window. So they really didn't do the stories justice, and given that that was one of the intents of this, failed pretty miserably on that. It also wasn't scary in the slightest. It was just a bit hammy. It was nothing about it was scary. And for being a horror movie that was trying to bring the macabre to the screen, it just didn't do it. The acting I gave, score of the intent, 8 out of 25. The acting I gave a 12 out of 25. It was just a bit hammy overall. This was definitely the acting level that you would expect for a made-for-TV movie, as in low budget, phoned in, let's get our paycheck and go home kind of thing. And I just got that sense out of it. Christopher Lloyd did stand out as a bright element of this, but I would say that his performance in this movie is nowhere near what it was in like Muse and I Am Not a Serial Killer. This was strictly Christopher Lloyd, reading lines and having some fun with it, and great acting, I would say no. Matt Frewer did a pretty good job there as one of the main characters, the guy with the hands that were talking to each other. He had a lot of physical performance going on that I thought he actually sold pretty well. But again, nothing really Oscar-worthy, nothing that really elevated this above just somewhat average. So yeah, right in the middle there, 12 out of 25. And the technical, I also give a 12 out of 25. The CG was actually not too bad for 1997 and for a made-for-TV movie and for a low budget and so forth. I can't understand how they could have possibly have pulled off using practical effects on a made-for-TV movie budget the notion of dozens of hands running around independently from one another without employing some CG. And I thought it was passable for the time. But even so, it wasn't that great. And the practical effects, I think, were just toned down way too much. It's the symptom of made-for-TV horror movie. I just, especially when we're talking about, pre-2000, it really just makes me cringe even thinking about it. There's only been a few, handful of things that have pulled it off. The Stand was... it was horror, but I thought that the reason it succeeded so well as a miniseries was because of the characters and the storyline, and it was more interesting. It wasn't that scary. when you think made for TV, it's not really synonymous with scary. There's a few standouts, but for the most part, no. And in this case, the practical effects were definitely toned down to the point where any amount of gore or scares and so forth just weren't really happening. In a measure of having dozens of disembodied hands running around, the notion of, I mean, not even CG, but practical effects, seeing them lying on the street there, and the sever point just being flat flesh, doesn't really work that well. So, yeah, 12 out of 25. I thought it was passable. It was average. There was just so much they could have done better, but this is what it is. So that gives us a total score of 42 out of 100 points. This is really not something that I would wind up having on my recommended list. I'm sorry, Ivy Killer, if that was the point you were trying to get across. I think we find ourselves in a level of disagreement if that's the case. But yeah, I mean, it's a short watch. It's an hour and a half long, grand total, including credits. If you are with family members and so forth that have, kids that aren't quite ready for, the real horror experience, this might not be a bad one to throw on. It's pretty toned down. Other than that, it's just not something that I would tell people, hey, you should go watch this. But that's just me, and that's just Quicksilver Highway. So I thank you for joining me here today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. If you like these videos, I welcome you to click subscribe. And next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.